Our first guest is one of the most innovative architects in the world who clearly wants to use architecture as a way to improve the human condition. To deal with climate change, he has proposed using wood to build high-rises. In Afghanistan, his urban planning does not start with the buildings moving out, but begins with the public parks, and the buildings come later. He thinks the design of schools need to keep up with the way children now learn, and he's got lots of innovative ideas on that. His creations can be seen from places as far as the Ottawa and Prince George airports, North Vancouver City Hall, the Iqaluit Cultural Center, of all places, and he's also working on the vertical farm in Vancouver. Very innovative stuff. He's a devoted father, and he and his son have committed to kayaking on every continent. They just actually came back from Antarctica. Please welcome Michael Green.
So I am an architect, but since my kids were born about 10, 12 years ago, I started writing children's books as well and illustrating them, not to publish, mostly just to sort of teach and tell stories to them that I thought were really important. A couple of years ago, for the first time ever, for one of the projects we have, I wrote a children's book that I wrote it 2 years ago, and I thought, okay, I have to illustrate it. And then when Sam asked me to do this evening, I thought, well, that's a reason to illustrate it. But of course, I waited till yesterday to begin illustrating it. So you're going to get to see a mostly finished book that I wrote, and I'm going to read it to you. And I've never read a story. I usually just wing these things, so I'm going to read this. The story is called Alpenglow. It begins in the mountains in the most unfinished drawing I did, but it really begins in a meadow. So down in the valley was a beautiful meadow. As the spring winds blew the seeds of the meadow, the seeds lifted into the sky and drifted off to new homes. One small adventurous seed drifted a little further and a little higher than the rest. A warm wind along the mountainside pulled the little seed ever higher until she finally settled on a rocky ridge next to a bird named Luna. Luna loved the mountains. Each morning she would fly up the ridge from the valley below to enjoy the sunshine. Each evening she would return to the ridge to see the sunset and watch the beauty of Alpenglow, that magical moment, golden moment of light that forms when the sun kisses the mountaintops goodnight as the valley drifts into moonlight. Luna named the small seed Alpenglow for that beautiful light and watched her happily grow on the sunny ridge. But soon the mountain winds arrived, and both Luna and Alpenglow began to struggle. Alpenglow was cold and lonely as she struggled to stand. Luna was worried for the young flower. Luna thought and thought, what could she do to help Alpenglow? She descended to a river valley to think. Dipping her beak in the water, a ring of ripples formed. And in that instant, Luna had an idea. Returning to the meadow, Luna talked with Alpenglow's family, the flowers that she came from. They gladly gave Luna some seeds, and off she flew. Luna planted the seeds in a circle around Alpenglow, and a new family grew around her to brace her from the mountain winds. But the winds were too ferocious, and even her family were struggling. Luna remembered the rings of water, and she returned over and over again to the valley until ring after ring was planted, and the mountaintop slowly transformed until the new meadow was finally complete, and in the middle of it all was Alpenglow. With the cold and wind sheltered by so many other flowers, she was finally safe. She was warm, she was strong, and she grew. So that's the fast version of the book, but I wrote this. I have 7 minutes. Because that's the beginning. So I wrote this book in the context of a project, as I mentioned, and really Alpenglow is her and this person. Alpenglow is really about the families and the sick kids that come from different parts of our province and from the Yukon that ultimately end up in a place and a project and an incredible resource we have in our community called Ronald McDonald House, which we at my firm have had the great honor of being able to design and work with this incredible team at Ronald McDonald House for the last 4 or 5 years. It's been a really rewarding thing on so many different levels, because you can imagine what happens when a family hears that their child is diagnosed with cancer or another severe illness, and literally that day, very often, they're put on a plane and are flown to Vancouver, uprooting their entire lives where, they have mortgages and they have jobs that they have to walk away from in order to be there for their sick child. They arrive in Vancouver, in the big city. They're from other communities to go to our children's hospital, and yet, they don't have, they're often staying in hotels. But if they're lucky, they end up in Ronald McDonald House, which this charity is an independent charity in our province. It's not, it gets some funding from McDonald's restaurants. I think a lot of us think that's where they're funded from, but that's only a little part. The rest comes from individuals and corporations that really recognize the value the organization gives to these families. And what's happening is we're moving from a house that serves 13 families in Shaughnessy to this new house that we're building that's 3/4 of the way through construction that will serve 72 families. So it's a really fun and important project on so many different levels, but the reason Alpenglow is an important starting point is I wanted to describe to you how the architecture of the building actually is very much the concentric rings of the flowers. Not only are we using the motif of Alpenglow in the design of the building, and the flower shows up in different parts and in the light fixtures and so forth, but we think about the building as these concentric rings ultimately of support, where a child and their family start in their room, and let's face it, they're sort of in shell shock when they arrive, and so there's a very nurturing space for them when they arrive. And then they're sort of starting to get used to this bigger house. So they get to know the people on their floor, and on their floor there's 6 families and a living room that they can get to know people, and people going through similar things. In their house, there are 18 families, and they all share a kitchen. It's a real community kind of environment. And 2 houses together share a dining room, so now all of a sudden there's 36 families. The concentric rings are growing, and 36 families create this really supportive place where everybody dines, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then ultimately 4 houses, each with 18 families, come together in the middle with this living room and these 2 courtyards that gather everybody, all 72 families, to really create the strength of community. But of course, this is really only the beginning, because the house sits in the middle of the Children's Hospital, which provides that next ring of support. And around that is the city of Vancouver and BC. This notion of the rings of support, the meadow, is sort of important for so many different reasons to the way we've been thinking about the house and how the house and the architecture could actually be part of creating a nurturing environment. But I'm going to kind of bridge in my last few seconds here, 10 seconds here. You clapped, so that doesn't count. I'm going to bridge this and say that, when you sit and draw for a long time, you can really think. And Alpenglow is a lot more than just the story about these really sick kids and the support we give them. I actually think that each and every person here is also Alpenglow, that you each sit and we each sit in the center of these concentric rings of support. Our families and our friends and the people that love us are in these rings. As these rings grow bigger and bigger, this is the community around us. And so we don't just sit in the middle of the rings, we also are participants in the rings. Right now, cities everywhere are growing. We live more densely than we've ever lived in history, closer together, and yet loneliness and isolation are the #1 concern of people living in Vancouver right now. So the paradox is these rings are failing us. And so as you look around today, and as I wrap things up, what I think is we all have this responsibility to grow our rings. And the simple gesture of reaching out and meeting a stranger is the beginning of growing. Our community has a challenge of becoming more and more friendly, more and more open. And so I just thought it would be a nice way to end, to challenge you to grow your rings and meet some strangers tonight. Thanks.